Hey guys, so we're going to have the first of several video lectures for you guys to watch and take notes on. So we're going to start with, I'm going to go ahead and share the PowerPoint and I'll talk through it, and you guys can take notes, and if you have questions then I'm happy to answer them in class or via email. So let's go ahead and share the screen. This PowerPoint is also available on the SaintsNet page. Okay, so let's go up here and let's. Okay, so first thing we're going to be talking about is this idea of systems. And there are lots of different kinds of systems. Specifically in AP Environmental, we're going to be talking about them mostly as biological systems, but we will also talk about some economic systems as well. So let's talk about what a system contains. So first of all, a system is a set of components that function and interact in some regular way. So in biology, one of the systems we talk about on a regular basis is the human body. We can talk about a river as a system, or as I said, we can talk about an economy as a system. So a system has three key components. It has inputs from its environment. Okay, so if we were to talk about the economy as a system, some of its inputs would be energy resources, matter resources, information. Then we put those into the economy, and there's a series of throughputs, and that goes right through that system, and we have an output to the environment. So when we talk about the output of the economy, certainly heat, waste, and pollution are outputs, but also goods and services. We could look at energy inputs from a human perspective. So we could look at human labor as one of our energy inputs as well into the economy. So if we were to talk about a system like a river, then we would be talking about energy resources from the sun, energy resources from the animals that live in the river. We would be talking about matter resources, specifically in terms of nutrients and macromolecules. And then going into the river, what would come out would be a different form of energy, certainly also some waste and pollution as well. Okay, so in any system, there are going to be a series of feedback loops. So when we talk about a feedback loop, we're talking about any process that increases the change to a system. We would call that a positive feedback loop. Or maybe it decreases a change to a system, and we would call that a negative feedback loop. You'll also hear these called reinforcing feedback loops or diminishing feedback loops. So a positive feedback loop would be one where the inputs or the changes are always going to reinforce it and cause what you guys might normally consider a snowball effect, or what we would call a vicious cycle. So a positive feedback loop is not necessarily a good thing. For example, when we talk about global climate change, so when more carbon dioxide goes into the atmosphere, that tends to increase the temperature. Well, as temperature increases, that causes melting of sea ice. As sea ice melts, it releases, and particularly as glaciers melt, they release carbon dioxide that's been trapped for a long time. Well, now we're adding more carbon dioxide that's going to increase that rate of change, and so that's a positive feedback loop. A negative feedback loop, if again we were to look at global climate change, would be the plant respiratory cycle. So as carbon dioxide in the atmosphere increases, then that means that plants can take in more carbon dioxide. That means they're going to grow faster. They're going to produce more green leaves, and that's going to use up more carbon dioxide. That's going to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And so there we have a negative feedback loop. So when we look at things like the global climate, there are a lot of feedback loops that are, some of them are positive and some of them are negative. We're going to have a lot of different interactions. But when we isolate them, we can talk about specific ones being positive and others being negative. Okay, and we'll talk more about systems and feedback loops in class. But now we're going to jump ahead just a little bit, and we're going to talk about ecosystems. So when we talk about an ecosystem, we need to talk first about this science called ecology. So ecology is the study of connections in nature between biotic components and abiotic components. And a biotic component is something that is living or was once living, and an abiotic component is non-living. And we'll come back to those definitions in a little bit more detail. So when we talk about ecology, we tend to talk about levels of organization. So the most basic level, well, when we get into biology, we go even lower than organisms. We're going to stick at the organism level. We're not going to go down to the cell and cell component portion of biology. So we're going to start, for our purposes in environmental science, with an organism. So an organism is an individual living being. And in our example here, we have the gazelle as an organism. And when we move to population, that's a group of individuals of the same species living in a particular place. So now we are talking about a herd of gazelle. When we move up one more level of organization, we move to a community. That's a population of different species living together in a particular place and potentially interacting with one another. Now we have a different picture here, but if we were to stick with the gazelles, we would be talking about gazelles and lions and cheetahs and elephants and zebras and other animals that all live together in the savannah. And when we move up one more level from the community, we can talk about an ecosystem. And an ecosystem is a community of different species interacting with one another and with their non-living environment. Okay, so when we get to the ecosystem, now we're talking about not just the biotic component, not just the communities, but the non-living portions as well. Above an ecosystem, we move into the level of a biome or into the level of a biosphere. So the biosphere is the parts of the earth where earth, water, and soil, air, water, and soil, are found. So there's a little mnemonic that you guys can use to help you remember these levels of organization. And it's old people catch easy breaks. Okay, so organism, population, community, ecosystem, and biosphere. Okay, so we have three main factors that sustain life on Earth. The number one is the one-way flow of high quality energy. So this is energy from the sun. Almost all of the energy on Earth comes from the sun. The only non-solar source of energy ultimately is nuclear energy. So when we talk about life on Earth, it gets its energy ultimately from the sun. It moves through the organisms, it disperses through the environment as heat, and eventually it does move back out into space. Number two, so we get the energy from the sun, but in order for plants and animals to be able to use that energy, we have to talk about the cycling of matter or nutrients through that biosphere. So this can be really quick cycling. This can take days, weeks, months, or even centuries. Okay, but chemistry rules all. So even though these are cycles and things move around, we are still governed by the law of conservation of matter. So you guys might remember these cycles: the carbon cycle, the water cycle, the phosphorus cycle, the nitrogen cycle from 7th grade life science. If you don't, that's okay. We're going to go into them in much more detail in environmental science. And then the third thing that supports life on Earth is gravity. We don't necessarily think about this one, but without gravity, the atmosphere does not stay in place. The nutrients don't stay on the Earth. And so we don't have a way to sustain those cycles. Okay, let's come back to those definitions of biotic and abiotic. So when we talk about biotic components, we are talking about things that are living or were once living, or we're talking about parts of organisms. So if we were to look at this forest that's in the background of our slide here, we would consider the trees to be biotic. We would also consider those fallen limbs, the leaf litter, the bugs that are in the leaf litter, all of the living creatures in there, as well as their waste, to be biotic. Okay, when we talk about abiotic, we are talking about things that are physical: wind, waves, sun, air, or things that are chemical. So those are things like the nutrients and the gases around us, okay? Okay, so let's talk about 3 kinds of symbioses. So you guys have probably heard about symbiotic relationships. So we're going to talk about 3 different kinds of symbiotic relationships. There are essentially only 5 types of relationships in biology, ecology. So we'll talk about these 3 and then we'll talk about the other 2. So first one is something called mutualism. So in mutualism, both species benefit, okay? Then we have commensalism. In commensalism, one species benefits and the other species isn't impacted at all. It's just neutral. And then, of course, we have parasitism. And in parasitism, one species is benefited and one species is negatively impacted. So I'm sure you guys can already come up with some examples, but we're going to talk about a few. So if we were to talk about a dog and a flea, the flea feeds on blood from the dog isn't benefited. The itching and the bites might lead to infection. So what do we think that is? We're going to call that parasitism because that does have a deleterious effect on the dog, but a positive impact for the flea. When we talk about fungus and algae, so when we talk about fungus and algae, this is something called a lichen. Okay, so the algae provide food for the fungus, but the fungus provides a nice moist environment for the algae. So in this case, both are benefiting. The fungus is getting food, the algae is getting a suitable habitat. So this is mutualism. It is positive for both species. When we look at a termite, okay, I know we think of termites as pests. They're actually one of nature's great recyclers. So in order for a termite to be able to digest the wood that it eats, it has to have bacteria in its gut. And the termite wouldn't be able to digest the cellulose without that bacteria, kind of like we wouldn't be able to digest our food without our intestinal flora and fauna. And so the termite benefits, so does the cellulose digesting bacteria. So once again, we have an example of mutualism. When we talk about a shark and a remora, remora fish swim alongside a shark, even attach themselves to the shark and take scraps of food that the shark drops during feeding. The shark is not affected by the remora. It's not even, doesn't really even notice that they're there. So this is a benefit to the remora. It is neutral to the shark. So this is our first example of commensalism. When we talk about cattle and the cattle egret, cattle egrets follow herds of cattle and they eat the insects that the cattle stir up as they move through grasslands or savanna, and cattle are unaffected. So again, we have one animal not affected and one animal benefiting. So that's an example of commensalism. And then our last example, hopefully you guys can figure this one out pretty quickly. This is an example of a tapeworm in a human being. The tapeworm lives in the small intestines of a human. It robs the human of essential nutrients. It can actually lead to different types of diseases. And so this is yet another example of parasitism. Okay, before we come to the other 2 types, let's talk about this idea of a niche. So a niche is something that is a species' role in its environment. When we talk about a niche, we're talking about both the preferred habitat, the position in the food web, and the mating and eating behaviors of an animal. So if we look at these 5 birds, they're all shore-dwelling birds, but they eat different things. They occupy different areas of the shore, and so they each have their own niche. Okay, so our other type of species interactions is competition. Oh, we skipped over one. There's one more, predation. So hopefully you guys know that one. So predation is where one species eats another species. This could be what we typically think of as a predator-prey relationship. So a lion catching a zebra or a gazelle and eating it. That's a typical example of predation. But we can also think of herbivorous animals as an example of predation, because even though they're eating plants, they are eating something else that is not a benefit to the plant, but it is a benefit to the animal that eats it. Okay, so our last type is competition. In competition, you have species competing for the same resources, whether that's food, nutrients, light, air. You can have 2 different kinds of competition. There's interspecific, meaning between two different species, and there's intraspecific. So that's within a species where you have multiple organisms within that species competing for the same resources. There's a couple of different outcomes that can come from competition. We can talk about resource partitioning, and we can talk about competitive exclusion. So when we talk about resource partitioning, this is when you have a species where multiple species avoid competition by dividing use of resources. So if we look at these 5 different warblers, they all live in the same type of tree, and they all eat the same food. But by occupying different parts of the tree, they all have space for nesting. So they're dividing their resource use, and they're not out competing one another. They're not going to interfere with one another's ability to survive and to continue thriving. On the other hand, we have what we call competitive exclusion. And when we talk about competitive exclusion, this is where one species basically pushes another one out of an area because it is a better competitor. Okay, so we'll come back to this when we talk about invasive species, but so when we talk about competitive exclusion, we talk about niches again. Our fundamental niche is the place where it could live. So if we look at this thalamus, which is a particular type of barnacle, its fundamental niche is from the low tide line all the way up to the high tide line. Barnacles need to be covered at least a certain portion of the day. Okay, so this thalamus, if there's no competitors there, it will occupy space on a rock from the low tide all the way up to the high tide line. However, if this other type of barnacle moves in, the Symbioses, okay, it's a better competitor in the lower area. And so, but it does not survive as well with less time underwater. And so the thalamus will wind up living in the upper area of its niche, and the Symbioses will live in the lower area of the niche. And that way, even though the thalamus has been pushed out of part of its fundamental niche, it still has its realized niche, and that's its actual niche when there is competition for resources and space. Okay, so that's it. If you guys have questions, let me know, and I'm happy to help and answer them.